Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dan Lewis, Executive Director of the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation. It is an honor to welcome you today to the 2020 U.S. Senate Candidate Forum. This is a great opportunity for us all to learn more about our Senate candidates, so we appreciate you joining us for this educational event. Before we move into the program, I want to quickly thank some key people who helped make today possible. First, our gold sponsor, Fidelity Investments, and our silver sponsors, CRL Associates and Swire Coca-Cola. Today's event is also co-hosted by 13 partners, including our affiliated organization, the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. In typical Colorado fashion, our community came together to make this business forum happen so that we could really spend some time learning the specifics, candidates' ideas and policies as they relate to doing business here and across the country. Those partners are the Aurora Chamber of Commerce, Colorado Association of Realtors, Colorado Business Coalition for Immigration Solutions, Colorado Competitive Council, Colorado Farm Bureau, Colorado Succeeds, Colorado Technology Association, the Douglas County Business Alliance, Downtown Denver Partnership, Grand Junction Economic Partnership, the Northern Colorado Legislative Alliance, and Visit Denver. As always, you can join the conversation. Just use the hashtag LFSenateForum and tag the foundation at Den Leadership. Please tweet early and often. At the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation and at the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, we don't endorse or contribute to candidates. For us, it doesn't matter who you are or what party you're a member of. The way we do business here is by inviting everyone who wants to work to the table. What matters most to us is that Colorado continues to be a great place to live and do business. We think convening candidates to educate us is critical to this process. With that in mind, we're also excited to delve into key business issues for our state. Today we have with us two candidates for U.S. Senate, incumbent Republican U.S. Senator Cory Gardner and challenger, Democrat, and former governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper. The winner of this election will have the opportunity to make a permanent mark on Colorado's and our country's economic climate. I look forward to hearing how they each plan to work with the private sector to implement their public policy ideas, which will, at the end, become an important part of their legacy as civic leaders. We are thrilled to have with us Ed Sealover, reporter for the Denver Business Journal and today's moderator. Ed is a reporter for the DBJ and a familiar face to many of us here in the room. He's been a reporter at the Denver Business Journal since March of 2009. He covers state government, transportation, economic development, hospitality, tourism, and the beverage industry. The 2020 legislative session was the 14th one that he has covered for 3 different newspapers, so I think he knows his way around politics. Please join me in welcoming Ed to set the stage for today's event and to welcome our first candidate.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation and its partners for hosting what we hope will be a highly informative event. Now, it's an honor to have today U.S. Senator Cory Gardner and former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper with us. We're looking forward to hearing from both of them on their ideas for Colorado and the business community. Now, how today will work. Each candidate forum will last about 35 minutes with an introduction, Q&A, and closing statements from each candidate. Senator Gardner will go first, but he'll come back and give his closing statement at the end of the event. A few things to note before we get started. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for opening remarks. Each candidate will have questions on the same topics which were shared with them prior to the event. I may ask a follow-up question to get more clarity or detail from a candidate, and each candidate will then have 2 minutes for closing remarks. So to start, let us welcome U.S. Senator Cory Gardner. Cory Gardner was elected to represent the state of Colorado in the U.S. Senate in 2014, and he currently sits on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee, where he chairs the East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy Committee. And yes, I did have to read all that off. Cory is a fifth-generation Coloradan raised on Eastern Plains in Yuma, Colorado. Cory graduated summa cum laude from Colorado State University before earning his law degree at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Cory and his wife Jamie still live in Yuma, where they are raising their 3 children, Allison, Thatcher, and Caitlin. After working as legislative director for Senator Wayne Allard, Corey was elected to the Colorado House of Representatives, where he served as minority whip. He then went on to represent the 4th Congressional District of Colorado in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2011 to 14 before taking his current position. Senator Gardner, thank you for being with us today, and please give us your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you today, and thank you to the Leadership Forum at the Denver Metro Chamber for this opportunity to share our views. I had hoped that we would have a chance to sit here with Governor Hickenlooper to have a conversations together, to have a open debate. Unfortunately, we aren't able to do that. I hope that we'll be able to do that more between now and Election Day. Look, it's an honor to serve the people of Colorado. Over the last 6 years, I have worked hard to become the 3rd most bipartisan member of the United States Senate, passing legislation like the Great American Outdoors Act, which has been called the holy grail of conservation legislation by the Nature Conservancy. It's been identified as the most significant conservation bill in our country's last 50 years of our country's history. And it is the biggest investment in public lands in the 200 plus years of our nation's history. Legislation like the 988 bill to create a 3-digit national suicide hotline to save lives. We lose somebody in Colorado every 7 hours to death by suicide. I've passed more laws into effect than the entire Colorado congressional delegation combined. I did that because I believe it's important to fight for Colorado. I believe it's important to be a doer, to solve problems, to create opportunities to bring people together, to decide what's important about getting our country back to work and how to get our country back to work. I've made sure that it isn't just about I-25 or Denver or Boulder or Fort Collins or Colorado Springs, but the solutions I bring to the state are a 4-corner solution. Because I-70 doesn't end at Vail, it doesn't end at Strasburg. It's about the successes we have in the Eastern Plains and the successes that we have on the Western Slope. And I've fought hard for every single corner of our state because I believe the smallest of communities, the most rural of our counties deserve a strong voice, somebody who's fighting for it, somebody who's making sure that we're looking out for everyone. We are only as successful as the least successful amongst us. And in Colorado, we have seen the highest of great opportunities, and we've seen the challenges of pandemics. And together we will get through it stronger than ever before, as long as all 4 corners have the chance to come together.
Well, thank you, Senator Gardner. Now let's get started with our Q&A. And I want to start with a topic that's been on everyone's minds for 7 months and will continue to be, the issue of COVID relief.
Yep.
As we look toward the coming months, what additional new federal relief and recovery measures would you support? And as you answer that, I want to kind of walk through what economic realities would trigger these additional measures, and how do you balance the tension between the economic needs of the country and the risk associated with a deficit budget?
Well, thank you, Ed, very much for the question. Look, COVID-19 is a tremendous challenge that we have to address. There are 3 things that we need to do. Number 1, we have to address the health pandemic itself. We need to make sure that we're helping individuals get through this together through unemployment benefits, help with rent and food payments. We need to make sure that we are getting businesses back open, their doors open, and back to work. Those 3 things aren't things you do 1, then 2, then 3. Those are 3 things that you actually have to do together at the same time, simultaneously. On April 16th, Governor Polis, Senator Bennett, my colleague in Colorado, and I sent a letter to Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer outlining the relief that needs to be done, and that relief needs to continue. It outlined additional support for state and local governments, making sure that we have flexibility for state and local governments, additional support for food nutrition programs. I was able to help get the public health emergency order extended so that it would not expire, and that includes additional help for Medicaid through this time. It also talks about extended help for paycheck protection programs to make sure that businesses are able to get a second draw on their loan, help for schools and education, that's K through 12 and our higher education institutions. It's about making sure that we have dollars for child care so families can help get back on their feet as they try to navigate when school is actually in person and when it is out of session and in-home learning. I don't think we can afford to look back on January 1st at this past year and say, gosh, everything is great, too bad we spent that much money. Because if we do that, we'll be lucky that we got through this together and that we got people back together and we got our economy moving again. Because the last thing that we can afford is to stand in front of the country on January 1st, look back and say, gee, I wish there could have been more that Congress did. Just a few weeks ago, I voted yes on a bill that would have provided $100 billion plus for education, that would have provided billions of dollars for small businesses to get the dollars they need to reopen, to keep their employees, dollars for education, child care, for the post office. That was legislation that received more than a majority of votes, received 52 votes. Unfortunately, there was a filibuster against it. It needed to get 60 votes, and it fell 8 votes shy. You know, we have had many opportunities, several debates over the last several weeks, John Hickenlooper and I have, and at every one of them, he talks about the need to have help for small businesses and child care and education, but yet he would have voted against the very relief that we had on the floor of the United States Senate. That's not a deception, that's not a mistruth, that's a fact. He said he would have opposed that bill. I don't think we can afford to oppose relief for the American people. I don't think we can afford to wait who wins an election on November 3rd to decide what happens next. The American people deserve and need relief now. That's why I'm fighting each and every day to make sure that we get our country through this together. You know, the pandemic reminded me of something that I read in our last church service before we had to go online for church, that out of our struggles and tribulations comes perseverance. Out of perseverance comes character, and out of character comes hope. And that's what we are in Colorado and how we will get through this together.
So let me follow up by asking, you mentioned a couple of areas, specifically state and local governments, small businesses. Okay. Bills to really put forward more state and local government aid, or bills like the Restaurants Act, which would put forward $120 billion, have not been able to advance through the Senate. Why not?
Yeah, I'm a sponsor of the Restaurant Act. I'm a sponsor of the Restart Act. I've put a plan forward called the Rehire Act. This is all about making sure that we help get people paid, back on their feet, and businesses open, that we particularly focus on those frontline workers in restaurants and the restaurant businesses, the hospitality, tourism, which Colorado is so well known for. So I'm pushing each and every day to get those done. The Paycheck Protection Program provided over $10.4 billion in loans to Colorado businesses, saving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs right here. Let's get that extended. Let's allow businesses to get a second loan. That will help restaurants, that will help tourism, that will help hotels, and we need to continue to do more. Look, there is no alpha and omega legislation, one bill that is going to solve everything. We've already passed 1, 2, 3, 4 measures, and there will be more even after we pass this next relief package. We have to do this to get our country back on track, back on its feet, and back to that economic level of success that we had prior to the pandemic.
Okay. Well, let's move on now to health care. You have stated that you want to replace the Affordable Care Act. If it were to be repealed, how would you address the affordability and access challenges it aimed to resolve when it passed? And what kind of things would you do specifically to retain components that many have appreciated, whether that be allowing for pre-existing conditions or people to stay on their parents' health insurance till 26?
Well, the primary promises of Obamacare were never realized. In fact, in Colorado, hundreds of thousands of insurance policies were canceled in spite of the promise that if you had your insurance, you'd get to keep your insurance. If you liked your doctor, you'd get to keep your doctor. That wasn't true for hundreds of thousands of Coloradans. Obamacare did not reach the goal of reducing healthcare costs, and that's why Republicans and Democrats agree that we will make sure we have protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I have legislation to require protection for pre-existing conditions, and that we will replace the Affordable Care Act with something that actually works to drive down the cost of healthcare and increase the quality of healthcare. Obamacare did neither of those. In fact, if you look at Colorado, Colorado remains in the bottom half of the states in terms of access for healthcare. So let's do this. Number one, let's make sure we have a plan that covers pre-existing conditions. Let's do that. Let's make sure no matter what happens, we cover pre-existing conditions. And you bet insurance for people who are 26-year-olds on their or younger on their parents' policy, you bet we can keep that and should keep that. Let's build a design around reinsurance pools. You know, I helped Governor Polis get a waiver through Health and Human Services at the federal level so that we could expand the reinsurance opportunities in Colorado and drive down cost. Work with risk pools to help manage high cost. Take better advantage of price transparency. If you can know the price of an F-150 Ford pickup at any dealership in the state, why can't we understand what a broken arm costs at a hospital? Let's bring price transparency to the forefront. Let's allow new technologies to empower people through a patient-centered program to have more control over their healthcare needs, their HSA systems, the dollars they receive from their insurance company for making good decisions. Those are the kinds of ideas that we can build a healthcare healthcare solution on. Telehealth that we've already seen so much great use of during the pandemic. That's something that we can focus on. But I am concerned about a government-run program. And if you listen to John, what he will tell you is he wants a public option. He admits that that public option would lead to a Medicare for all scenario. That scenario will cost 176 plus million Americans, 176 million Americans, the insurance that they receive through their employer. That would wipe out their employer-based health insurance policies. Not only that, but the public option would increase the payroll taxes on workers by an astounding $2,300 per worker. And we know the devastating impacts that that public option plan would have on rural healthcare. Look, we already have 22 counties in Colorado that only have one insurance company to choose from, one option to choose from when it comes to their healthcare. The last thing we need to do is to devastate rural Colorado healthcare even more because of this. John Hickenlooper himself said that he wanted to replace the Affordable Care Act. That's why he and Governor Kasich went around the country talking about their replacement plan.
And we will certainly hear from Governor Hickenlooper on this. I want to go back to what you said, though. You talked about access and cost. You mentioned a couple things that are already in place, keeping pre-existing conditions, 26-year-olds. What about what you described will actually bring down costs, though, especially knowing we in Colorado have already done things that you've expressed interest in, like reinsurance pools? What is going to your package?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done that. We need to do that on a massive scale, a national scale. We have not had the success that we need with those programs, and that's why the ideas that I have laid out will do that, to make opportunities for association health plans work. We sell red tractors in Yuma. Our neighbors sell green tractors in Yuma. Why can't we have the two companies come together under one policy to drive down those costs? Empowering people to use their health savings accounts for home care. That's something that will drive down costs. The other idea, of course, is technology. In telemedicine itself, we can reduce the amount of visits that a stroke patient may be misdiagnosed with. Many times, a Flight for Life, one of the most expensive forms, and thank goodness we have it, of healthcare is sent to a stroke patient when they actually don't need it. But using telehealth, connecting a hospital with a stroke center like Swedish Hospital, you can actually prevent 80% of those most costly forms of transfer because they don't need to take that Flight for Life medical life-saving trip. They can actually be transported through an ambulance or other modes of transportation. So those kinds of technologies and tools will help drive down costs. But the risk pools at the federal level, the reinsurance mechanisms that we helped the state of Colorado achieve, broadly implemented, will drive down costs. Look, Obamacare did not drive down costs. The promise was that if you passed the Affordable Care Act, you'd see the average cost decrease by thousands of dollars. That's simply not true. And that's why both Republicans and Democrats agree it needs to be replaced.
All right. Well, let's move on to another topic on a lot of minds and give it a very specific business lens here, and that's the topic of immigration. The U.S. immigration system hasn't been modernized in decades, while our economy and workforce needs have changed dramatically in that time. So how would you reform our immigration system, specifically to allow Colorado and the nation to attract and retain the talent we need to better compete in the global economy?
Yeah, it's something that my wife and I have talked about and our kids, that if we were born anywhere else around the world, what we wouldn't do to get here to the United States, the greatest nation, and in Colorado, the greatest state in the greatest nation. We would do anything we could to get here from wherever we were outside of the country. So we need an immigration system that recognizes that value, that most of us came here from somewhere else, ourselves or our families did years ago. In my case, my family came 100 plus years ago from Ireland and Germany, eventually finding themselves in Yuma. If they'd just spent a couple more days in a covered wagon, they probably could have been all the way to Aspen, but they stopped in Yuma, and I'm very glad that they did. So we need a system that recognizes we're a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. So let's have a system that fixes the entry-exit system. 42% of the people who are here without documentation today came legally on a valid visa but overstayed their visa. Let's address that. I worked with Senator Bennett on the Gang of Six bill, Senator Menendez, Senator Durbin. Actually, Senator Durbin, I received a National Immigration Forum award, the Courage to Lead award from the National Immigration Forum because of the work that Senator Durbin and I did together. And he actually said what Cory Gardner did took courage as a Republican to lead on. Our bill together would have addressed border security, it would have addressed asylum curriculum. It would have addressed the family migration challenges that we had, TPS issues that we have together. Those ideas would make our immigration system work. We have farmers like Robert Sakata who no longer grow sweet corn because they can't find the labor that he needs to harvest the sweet corn. We need to address that. We need to recognize that a corn harvest is a certain time of the year, but that's different than a demand for an engineering company that may need more high-tech visas because that's a 365-day of the year function. So we need an immigration system that helps get us the numbers we need to address everything from the farm labor to the high-tech sector to the medical sector and work in a way that lifts the caps and gets people here quicker, allows people on that road to become a citizen faster than it does right now, because the system we have right now actually discourages people from following the law and results in a system where people may be encouraged, a disincentive of the law, to be in violation of the law. We need to pass the DREAM Act. We don't have, we don't charge a 5-year-old kid for walking across our neighbor's lawn with agricultural trespass. We need to pass the DREAM Act to make sure that we put people on a path to citizenship who are brought here at a very young age through no fault of their own. That's why I'm supportive of the DREAM and Promise Act, and that's why I've introduced the DREAM Act in the United States Senate to make sure that we can provide that future for so many of the kids that go to school with our 2 daughters and our son in Yuma, Colorado.
Now, what specific changes do we need, though? And I want you to answer that knowing that you're serving under a president, your own party, who has made unilateral changes, cutting back H-2B, H-2A visas. What changes do we need, and how does the Senate take control of this to do what you want?
Well, look, I think we had that opportunity on the floor of the Congress a while back, where I voted for every single immigration reform legislation that I introduced with Senator Bennett. That's a great start. It addresses our security need for new judges on the border to make sure that we have the personnel in place to avoid the kind of disasters that we saw and the detentions that we saw. That's got to stop. We need more personnel. We need more roads. We need more security, yes, but let's fix the entry-exit system. Those kinds of solutions actually work. Let's address the visa issues to lift the caps. That's something that Congress can legislate on. That's something that I continue to work on with the administration itself. In the meantime, since Congress has enacted, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration acted unilaterally at times. And the best solutions are going to come from Congress. That's why we need to work in a bipartisan fashion. That's why I brought the Gang of Six together. That's why under the leadership of Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin and Michael Bennet, to come to a solution that can actually make our immigration system work. I'm dedicated to this, and it's certainly one of the most forward-leaning Republicans when it comes to recognizing the need and championing the cause for a workable immigration system. I think it was the former CEO of Gallup, the polling institution, that said if we have a high-tech STEM degree, we should stamp a green card to, or staple a green card to every single one of those degrees. We should do something like that to make sure that we have that workforce we need, everything from labor on up to high-tech, engineering, medical fields, and everywhere in between. And particularly our tourism and hospitality industry in Colorado and the mountains and the ski resorts that rely on it.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to a topic that I think a lot of business leaders wish were being discussed more in these races, and that's transportation. Transportation investment in Colorado is important, both in terms of moving goods and people, but also in terms of retaining the workforce who appreciate our proximity to the mountains. So, as senator, if you're reelected, would you push for an infrastructure stimulus package that seems to have disappeared in discussions at Washington in recent years? And how would you help direct those stimulus projects into Colorado? And while we're on it, tell us what key components of any package you would support would be.
Well, absolutely. If you look at Colorado, we have an interstate highway system that looks very similar to what it looked like in the 1960s, a highway system overall, even though we've seen tremendous growth in our state. So we need an infrastructure package. I support the EPW passed bill that came out with strong bipartisan support to extend our highway bill for the next 5 years, but we need to go beyond that and actually pass a major infrastructure bill. I believe we should spend billions of dollars to increase and improve our roads and bridges in Colorado that have quite frankly been left behind. Over the last several years, I've brought over $300 million back to Colorado to expand I-25 North from Colorado Springs to Castle Rock and I-25 North from Brighton to Fort Collins. Millions and millions of dollars that we've put to expand those lanes to ease congestion. We've, I think, just announced a $60+ million grant that we received and worked hard to secure for I-70 through Eagle County. to deal with traffic challenges through the mountain corridor. I just introduced legislation to make the Ports to Plains corridor on eastern Colorado designated as an interstate. And so we ought to make sure that we look at infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, as a massive infusion. For every $1 million we spend in infrastructure, Ed, it creates 6 to 7 jobs. So we can have this work stimulus and this economic opportunity in a state that desperately needs better transportation solutions. If you look at the 1 out of every 4 or 5 miles in Colorado is a failing road, receiving an F. We can do better, and that's because of the failed leadership of the state to get that job done over the last 8 years to 10 years. We need to put more dollars into our infrastructure. The other thing that we need to do is not just focus on roads and bridges, we should focus on mass transit ideas. That's why I've been supportive of the Front Range Rail and why I've been supportive of the Southwest Chief to make sure that all 4 corners of our state are receiving those dollars. We just announced a significant infusion of funding into the Roaring Fork Transit Authority, which is the largest rural transit authority in the state, actually in the country. And that's the good work that they have been doing through the Roaring Fork area with mass transit. But we also need to expand into unserved and underserved areas for broadband. I've introduced legislation called the Deploy Act, which would advance fund billions and billions of dollars to get broadband into unserved and underserved areas across Colorado at a time when we're learning at home and distance learning and commuting on Zoom and everything else. We need that ability for broadband investment to help people across our state. We also need to make sure that we invest in drinking water and wastewater systems. Just a few weeks ago, I secured funding for a project that was signed into law by President John F. Kennedy in Pueblo, Colorado in 1962 to provide 50,000 people with clean drinking water from Pueblo, Colorado to Lamar, Colorado. We finally broke ground on that pipeline just a couple of weeks ago. That's a major infrastructure project that could create 4,000 jobs in southern and southeastern Colorado. We need to build water storage projects like NISP. You know, having a water plan is nice, but a water plan doesn't store water. You actually have to have the projects being built to store water. That's why I support NISP. That's why I support conservation. That's why I support public-private partnerships to help make sure that we have the infrastructure we need. Infrastructure is an all-of-the-above effort that we should be pursuing for stimulus, for economic opportunity, and for the growth of our state.
So it's clear you support this, but what are we talking about here? $1 billion, $2 billion? Where does the funding
No,
come
look,
from?
I think if you look at the funding, I mean, you're talking close to, if not exceeding, $1 trillion. We've put billions of dollars through the authorization of the highway bill. We're talking about, thanks to the 2017 tax cuts, we had $1 trillion+ come back into the United States. These were U.S. companies that weren't bringing their dollars back because of the taxes that they would have to pay if they brought that money back. But now that we have that reforms, they're bringing those dollars back. We could create an infrastructure bank based on those dollars coming back into the United States. That would create significant funding for us, new bonding ideas that we could utilize, new public-private partnerships that we could utilize to help fund transportation. These are all things that we should pursue to create that stimulus. Look, we shouldn't have a highway system that takes a couple hours to get to the kids' soccer games just across town over a weekend. It shouldn't take us an entire Friday and an entire Sunday to get up to the mountains to go skiing and being stuck in traffic. With the solutions that we have in front of us, pass them, get them in place, we can create jobs, opportunity, and certainly improve the lives and business opportunities for the state of Colorado.
Okay. Let's move on now to education. Students, and I want to focus on this area, students of color have historically been the least well served by our education system, and COVID's only exacerbating achievement gaps. Tell us what you think the role of the federal government is in closing those gaps and improving educational outcomes for all students. And as you define that role, what specific measures, if any, does the Senate need to take toward that goal?
Well, look, I've worked with a lot of my colleagues in the Senate to address this very challenge, the achievement gap, the wealth gap between minority families, and what it means to actually have solutions to close that wealth gap, to expand wealth gap opportunities, to expand, to close the education gap, and to create new education opportunities for our minority communities across the state of Colorado. I worked with the passage of the the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. That was the reauthorization of our education bill. I worked closely with Elizabeth Warren. We introduced legislation that focused on minority students and making sure that we understand why different ethnic groups may be succeeding or not succeeding in school. And we passed that law. It is now the law of the land, and we're getting back great information about what is working for Asian Americans, what's working for African Americans, to make sure that we see how our education and policies are either surpassing our expectations or failing our expectations, so that we can use that data, that knowledge, that understanding to make the improvements that we need. I work closely with Tim Scott and my colleagues, Lamar Alexander, to pass for the first time ever mandatory funding for historically black colleges and universities across this country. We're working hard right now to make sure that we have more dollars for Hispanic-serving institutions. And I also passed legislation in that same Every Student Succeeds Act to help expand the dollars that could be utilized for concurrent and dual enrollment programs. Let me tell you a story about a young student at Denver East High School. It's where my grandmother went, actually. She graduated from East High School a long time ago. But this girl, African American, never thought she'd be able to make it to college. She didn't know if she was going to have the grades to do it. She certainly knew she couldn't afford it. Thanks to dual enrollment, college courses that she took at East High School, not only did she go to school, she got a scholarship at school, and she started at Colorado State University, and she started as a sophomore instead of a freshman. So I passed legislation to open up concurrent and dual enrollment programs and to allow those dollars, more dollars in education, to be used to help those students succeed, to get that education through higher education while they're in high school. They could actually take a fifth year, basically, and use those education dollars to use that fifth year concurrent and dual enrollment program to help accelerate their opportunities in college and to advance their careers and their lives. This is an incredibly important issue that we get right. And that's why I've supported new flexibilities in Pell Grants, expanding ways that we can use those Pell Grants for industry-approved programs. All of them should be focused on how do we help not just those who've had generations of college degrees in their family, but that first-generation learner, that first-generation college student, that first-generation American, and their kids, to make sure that every nook and cranny of our country succeeds.
Should we look at doing something to bring down the cost of college, whether that be community colleges or four-year colleges? Is that not the role of the federal government?
Well, look, I think the states are looking at this right now. If you look at what happened under John Hickenlooper as governor, college tuition in Colorado increased 65%. If you look at that time frame he was governor, we actually had Colorado students burdened with an additional $176 million worth of student loans. I've got a student loan. I'm the third youngest member of the United States Senate, and probably the only one that may still have a student loan. But the fact is, this is a burden. So the Congress does have a responsibility to work on these issues. That's why I've introduced legislation to allow an employer. Look, in Colorado, prior to the pandemic, one of the biggest challenges our employers had was finding the workforce that they needed. And so my bill would allow employers to pay an employee as an incentive to work for them their student loan. They could pay off their student loan. And that employee could receive that money as an incentive to stay at that business. They wouldn't have to pay an income tax. There'd be no payroll taxes on these dollars. This would be a way to help people address the student loans affordability. The states need to work on affordability, just as the federal government ought to make sure that if you're receiving aid, if a university is receiving aid, let's have some transparency. Let's make sure that students know how long it's going to take to pay back that student loan. Some of that information is available. Let's make sure it's easier for them. Let's clarify the forms that it takes to get student aid so people understand it. Let's make sure that a student graduating with a political science degree or an engineering degree or a medieval arts degree understands what they're going to be paid if they get a job in those fields, what the average first year, second year, fifth year graduate of that university in that degree program makes, so they know and can make better choices. Some of that information is available. It ought to be a lot more easy to get.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to oil and gas. And this is a topic where we're going to ask slightly different questions because we know the two of you and Governor Hickenlooper, stand very far apart on this. You've called yourself an all of the above energy person. So would you seek any tightening of oil and gas regulations if reelected? And also, what specifically would you do to advance renewable energy or address climate change if reelected?
Yeah, look, I'm an all-of-the-above energy believer. because I do think we need it all. We need it to have affordability, reliability. You have brownouts in certain part of our country right now because they don't have the stability in the grid to meet with demand. I've talked to CEOs of companies around the world who look at U.S. manufacturing opportunities and are so jealous of what we have in this country because of affordable, abundant electricity that we're able to generate. I believe in traditional energy and the 230,000 jobs that have been created in Colorado. That's a $31 billion part of our economy in the state, $1 billion of taxes paid to schools and to build new schools and roads. I believe in renewable energy. That's why I fought to save wind energy in the 2017 tax cuts. It's why the production tax credit. It's why I fought to save solar tax credits. It's why I've introduced legislation to expand investments in battery technologies, because that really will be a revolutionary game change when it comes to our country's ability to have a clean energy future. But I'm not willing to turn to 230,000 families in Colorado and say that government knows better than they do about where they should work, how they should work, and what they should do. John Hickenlooper wants to lay off, to fire, to eliminate, to terminate 230,000 families and their job. 230,000 people, 230,000 Colorado families would lose their job under his vision. You bet we'll support ideas that make sense when it comes to regulations. You bet that there's common sense that Congress could and should pursue when it comes to pipeline safety. I've supported those measures and those regulations. When it comes to storage tanks, I've supported those measures and those regulations. I've supported giving the agencies with oversight the power to make smart regulations for the people of this country to have a cleaner tomorrow than they do today. But I'm not willing to sacrifice entire communities. John Hickenlooper ran a TV commercial about closing down coal-fired power plants in northwestern Colorado. That will result in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs being lost in places like Craig and Meeker. And his solution is, well, those jobs will be replaced by wind and solar. Well, you know what? There are going to be new jobs by wind and solar. But will those hundreds of people in Craig, Colorado that moved there because they wanted to lead their lives there, are those wind and solar jobs going to be in Craig, Colorado? The hundreds of people that lost their job thanks to his policies? Look, I believe that we can have innovation and that we should have innovation. That's why I have led a 50% increase in funding at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory right here in Golden, Colorado. That's why I've supported the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. That was my legislation that increased funding for the NIST and for the National Science Foundation to make sure that our research, development, and innovations create new opportunities in energy. But I do not believe that we should go further than the Green New Deal like John Hickenlooper has said he would. That would devastate our farmers and ranchers. It would put hundreds of thousands of Coloradans out of work. It would be a $93 trillion tax on our economy. I just think that is taking it too far when it comes to the success of our state.
So just to be clear then, and I think I know the answer, but I want to get you on this. There had been talk about banning fracking on federal lands, reducing fracking permits. It doesn't sound like that is something you're interested in.
Well, I think that's a horrible idea. Now, John Hickenlooper has said that he would make oil and gas obsolete. That means that he would be supportive of anything that would make those jobs go away. That's 230,000 people in Colorado that would lose their jobs. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris have said that they would ban fracking. They would start with public lands and probably extend it beyond that. Kamala Harris is a co-sponsor of legislation that would devastate farmers and ranchers in this state and certainly our economy. You can't blow a $31 billion hole in our economy, lay off 230,000 workers, and expect there to be no impact.
Okay, thank you. I want to move ahead to the last topic, and this is a bit of a catch-all that we're going to ask both of you about. We've gone through 6 very important issues, the business community here. You have a priority that we haven't hit on that is particularly relevant to the business community you want to highlight. And in doing so, keep in mind this question: how would the efforts of this priority make a different result than we've seen the last 6 years that you've been in Congress?
Well, look, I think 2 things. If you look at the 2017 tax cuts and you look at trade opportunities for Colorado, the 2017 tax cuts prior to the pandemic resulted in African American families and Hispanic families seeing their family wealth grow 33% and 65% respectively. We saw in Colorado household incomes increase by over $1,400 as a result of the 2017 tax cuts. We saw record low unemployment rates. Look, I've fought for the last 10 years to make sure Colorado has the #1 economy. John likes to take credit for it, but the fact is we blocked a lot of his tax increases that would have hurt the economy. We stopped a lot of the regulatory overreach that he supported at the Obama administration to make sure that we have this economic growth and record of success for Colorado. I was proud to partner with people across Colorado and the Denver Chamber and businesses across the state to make sure that we had those investments succeeding in our state. The 2017 tax cuts created opportunity zones. 60% of them in Colorado are in rural areas. If you are a worker, an employee in an opportunity zone, your wages are growing at about 8% faster than they are in a non-opportunity zone area. John Hickenlooper wants to eliminate, roll back, repeal the 2017 tax cuts. That would wipe out the opportunity zones. That would undo the 7% increase in household income we've seen in the western part of the United States that Reuters has credited in part to the tax cuts. That would undo the small business tax cuts that individual proprietors, small mom and pop businesses were able to receive. They would see higher taxes as a result. I don't think that's a way to get our economy moving again out of a pandemic by imposing the most significant tax increase this country has ever seen. I don't think a massive regulatory overreach into these businesses would help either. On trade, look, I'm pro-trade. I'm a free trade believer. We need to enter into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Unfortunately, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump opposed them when they ran for president. I don't like tariffs. I think we do need to stand up against China, make sure that we are protecting intellectual property rights, opening markets, and not letting them cheat. But I think tariffs are a tax on the American consumer. I led the passage of the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. It's one of the bills that I have passed to have passed the most laws into effect in the entire Colorado congressional delegation combined. That bill opens up the door to a Southeast Asia trade agreement, to opening up Jordan Cove and exporting Colorado-produced energy and Colorado jobs that we create as a result, and making sure that that power, that energy, gets to places like South Korea, Taiwan, to Japan. Those are the kinds of opportunities that we have with trade. My bill calls for trade agreements with Taiwan, and I'm working with President Tsai. I brought President Tsai to Denver, the first president of Taiwan to ever be in the interior part of the United States, where we focused on that U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. We should expand that. We in Colorado created thousands of jobs in Korea as a result of our free trade agreement. We've redone that. We need to continue building on that. Trade is a huge opportunity for agriculture, for manufacturing, for technology in Colorado, and I've built a solid record of pro-trade, free trade opportunities.
1 minute or less, again, the president stands in a different place than you with trade. How does the Senate effectively counter that if you really want to open up markets?
Well, we passed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which has been, I think, helping Colorado create new jobs. We passed legislation to continue and further the South Korea trade agreement. The administration has said they're open to a European Union trade agreement, and they would consider that a bilateral agreement. That's good. But I continue. In fact, I actually voted against the president's trade representative because I was concerned about their trade positions and policies. But we've been working with them to make sure that we pursue a Taiwan agreement, and we're actually making progress. We have the Japan bilateral agreement in place that is making progress between the United States and Japan. The way we have better behavior from China is not by isolating ourselves on the world stage. It's actually by surrounding them with coalitions and trade partnerships that force good behavior. If 80% of the global economy is in one trade agreement and you surround China with those standards and those rules of law and contract, they're going to have to follow those rules and standards of conduct that we believe we value based on the rule of law. And if we do that, we're going to expand and exceed any expectation. And that's why I simply disagree with the administration on some of these trade. I agree that we need to push back on China's bad behavior, but let's get everybody engaged to enforce good behavior and open up new trade opportunities.
Well, thank you, Senator Gardner. Now, just the audience again, Senator Gardner will return to provide his closing remarks after former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper provides his responses. So thank you,
Thanks,
and
Ed.
we'll see you back here.
Thank you.
All right, now we are going to welcome former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. John Hickenlooper didn't take a familiar path to public office. After working as a geologist, he became a brewer and small business owner whose successful pub was part of the revitalization of a neglected warehouse district in Denver. John served as mayor of Denver from 2003 to 2011, and during that time he served in leadership roles with the United States Conference of Mayors. He also served as governor from 2011 to 2019. John is married to Robin Pringle, and the two live in Denver. He has one son, Teddy. And we would like to welcome former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper to the stage now. Hi, good. Yes, the long-distance elbow bump. That's how we do debates in this era. Governor Hickenlooper, thank you for being here with us. We'll let you get right to your opening remarks before we start talking about the same topics we've just talked about with Senator Gardner.
Yes, well, thank you, Ed, and I appreciate all of you taking time out of your day to watch the chamber debate, or forum, I guess it is. Anyway, most of you know my story. I got laid off when the commodities markets exploded in the mid-'80s. I was out of work for a couple years, ended up opening one of the first brew pubs in the country in lower downtown Denver, back when the rent was $1 a square foot per year. I took the lessons that we used to create that small business and rebuild Lodo and tried to take that into city government, the optimism, the problem solving, the innovation. And it actually works pretty well in government. They're very different systems, but it works well. And then we took that into state government. And when I got elected in 2011, in the Great Recession, Colorado was 40th in job creation. We were really struggling to diversify our economy. And I went all over the state and tried to bring people together to create a business plan for the entire state. In that process, we were going through the worst droughts, the worst wildfires, the worst floods in almost a century. And as we battled with those natural disasters, we still came together, and for the last 3 years of my second term, we were the #1 economy in the country. In my last budget, we had a $1.3 billion surplus coming in. We're facing the same thing in Washington right now. The White House negligence in responding to COVID-19, and then ultimately their incompetence when they did respond to it, has turned our economy upside down. 220,000 Americans have lost their lives. We need to do in Washington what we did in Colorado, which is to come together. And in this case, I think we need to rebuild our economy in a more equitable fashion, so that we can recognize that, we have gone through so much and people have lost so much, and we are going to rebuild our system better than it was before. And we're not going to do this with the same people in Washington. I think, if we don't get new people in Washington, nothing's going to change. That's why I'm asking for your vote and your support. Together we can change Washington.
Well, I think that segues well into our first topic here, one that's been on people's minds for a long time, and that's COVID relief. As we look toward the coming months, what additional new federal and recovery measures would you support? And as you answer this, I want to ask you to think about what economic realities for you would trigger these additional supports, and how do you balance that tension of the economic need and the risks associated with a deficit budget?
Yeah, well, this is a significant question of this election, both with myself and Cory Gardner, but also with President Biden, or with Vice President Biden and President Trump. We can't cut back right now. I mean, we've gone 6 months without relief. Myself and I think many Coloradans find it frustrating that we can't get any relief through in the last 6 months, and yet the Republican Senate is rushing through a Supreme Court nomination that is going to just create more commotion and more division. What we learned in Colorado going through all those wildfires and floods of my first term was you've got to unify, and people have to have a common purpose. So I believe we need to continue the relief efforts to make sure we have funding for municipalities, counties, states. We don't want to have to start laying off our first responders. We've got to have sufficient resources for school districts so they can get protective equipment. Finally, why don't we finally create a supply chain so that we have testing capacity for the schools, for small businesses, for everyone. And then last, obviously, most importantly, we have to have the relief for workers who've lost their jobs, for small businesses, especially the truly small businesses that are at risk of not being able to reopen. So we do have to be frugal. We have to look at the deficit, the $1 trillion tax reduction that Trump pushed through. I'm sure many people in the chamber appreciate it, but it's not without its costs. And it has pushed us dangerously close. It never did pay for itself. And now with the burdens of having to respond, an incompetent response to COVID, we are stretching we're adding to our deficit in a way that, we've got to be very mindful of it. But this is not the time to pull back, because I think we are at risk of having an elongated or an exaggerated recession could turn into 5, 10 years of depression. My mom was born in 1921. I heard a lot of stories about what the Depression was like.
Let me ask specifically, because you talk about the need to relook at the $1 trillion tax cut there. What does that mean in your mind? Do we need to go back and repeal parts of that tax cut to help pay for the COVID relief going forward? If so, are there specific areas you want to repeal?
Well, the first thing I always say is to make sure that, we have put enough burden on the middle class already. So we don't want, I would never vote for anything that would increase taxes on the middle class. A lot of those, or some of those tax benefits from the 2017 tax bill came to the middle class, and we've got to protect them. They were temporary. They were the temporary part of that bill. I think to a large extent they should be made permanent. The other parts of it I think we have to examine and look at what are the resources we're going to need ultimately, and where are they going to come from. If you want to talk about, I'm sure we'll get to infrastructure. This is the Chamber of Commerce, but some of these things that we know that we need and we have been kicking the can down the road, it's time to really put ourselves in that position to really get something done about it. And I want to emphasize just that, the 8 years I was governor, we went through huge natural disasters. The wildfires have gotten worse and worse. We're spending tens of millions of dollars. When I first came in, it was $2 or $3 million a year. Now we're spending, who knows, I think this year's probably well over 30, probably over $40 million. Those expenditures came from somewhere, and yet when you grow your economy, and it's one of the things I want to make sure I can take to Washington, that experience of having been a small business person, lying awake at night trying to figure out how I'm going to make payroll the next week. Those experiences I think are what are going to allow us to balance, where do we take the money from, and how do we most efficiently get the maximum benefit when we spend it.
Excellent. Now, I want to just inject real quick. While I enjoy having this face-to-face conversation with you,
I got to look to them?
Yes, you want to look to
the
people who are watching us.
I thought there was a camera back there, but
no worries. But I appreciate the back and forth. I want to move on, however, to another topic of importance to business leaders, and that's healthcare. You have, in the past, expressed your support for the Affordable Care Act. Many things you did during your governorship showed that. But even with the ACA in place, many Americans are critical of our current healthcare system. So how would you, if elected, address ongoing healthcare challenges, such as rising healthcare costs, while keeping the ACA in place? And what's your proposal for reducing healthcare costs along the full spectrum of care while ensuring access?
Sure. And let me reiterate what I've said many times, that healthcare, I believe, is a right, not a privilege. The Affordable Care Act is the first major program initiated by the U.S. government, to my knowledge, that has never been improved. For 10 years, the Republican opposition has been trying to repeal it and have blocked every attempt to improve it. When we did Social Security, when we first did Medicare, in the following years, all kinds of problems appeared, and we solved them and found better ways to control costs and get better efficiencies. We haven't been able to do that. And this is one of the biggest differences between Cory Gardner and myself. I believe that what President Obama created is a good foundation. It needs to be improved. When I came in as governor, we expanded, through the Affordable Care Act, expanded Medicaid and covered 400,000 people who hadn't had coverage before. Almost 50,000 of those individuals were in rural parts of the state. We helped keep 12 rural hospitals in business. And that coverage was important. We got to almost 95% coverage. To get to 100% coverage, which I think is important, we're probably going to need some sort of a public option, a sliding scale. And let me make clear that I've never been in favor, despite what Cory Gardner says, I've never been in favor of getting rid of private insurance. Millions, over 100 million Americans value and want to preserve their private insurance, and they deserve that right. But I do think a sliding scale public option allows people who can't find healthcare on the exchanges an opportunity. And I think you have to be careful that we don't unfairly advantage this public option to put insurance companies out of business or at too great a disadvantage. I also think that we can allow the federal government the right to negotiate bulk discounts for prescription drugs like every other industrialized nation does. That can go a long way to paying for that public option. We also should look at more transparency. And when people are going to get an assessment or a procedure, they can look on their cell phone and see, here are the 5 places where I can get a quality product, and here's what my copay is going to be in each one, and allow people's actions to actually control the inflation in the market. I think we also have a lot of bloat in the healthcare industry, and we are the most affluent country on earth. We should have the best healthcare system in the world, which I think we do. We're just not very efficient. And that's just a question of focus and putting our mind to it. Donald Trump and Cory Gardner have been trying to get rid of the Affordable Care Act from the beginning. And Cory has voted 13 times to try and cut the funding or eliminate the Affordable Care Act. He's voted 9 times to get rid of the protections for pre-existing conditions. And he says he has a bill, a 117-word bill. All it says is basically we will protect pre-existing conditions, but it doesn't say anything about insurance companies having to limit what they can charge. So they'll just charge through the roof, and people, of course, won't be able to afford the insurance. This is the cruelest lie of all, because there are 2.4 million Coloradans who have pre-existing medical conditions. And when this Supreme Court appointment goes through, on November 10th, they're going to begin hearing the case that Cory Gardner and Donald Trump have been spending millions of dollars pursuing. It's gone all the way to the Supreme Court to try and once and for all get rid of the Affordable Care Act. They couldn't change it legislatively. Now they're trying to legislate from the bench. And I think that's going to put a lot of Coloradans in very challenging situations, and especially those who have pre-existing conditions.
And let me follow up by asking, you mentioned a couple ideas there that seem to be focused on helping people to pay less for insurance. What about the overall cost of healthcare? Is there a way to bring down the overall cost of healthcare, or is that government overstepping its bounds if it gets into that?
No, that's what I was referring to when I talked about efficiencies and creating more transparency. We've created this protective bubble where so many of the healthcare providers all are not really competing with each other, but kind of balancing each other out, but allowing, I think, excessive costs again and again. You look in the rest of the industrialized world. You go to Europe, and the highest countries are spending 10 or 11% of their GDP on their healthcare. We're at 18%, going towards 19%, and our outcomes aren't any better. In many cases, they're worse. So I think that points out that we really do have some serious inefficiencies we can address. And I think, it's not going to take edicts from Washington, and I don't think we have to, again, I've never supported getting rid of private insurance, but we are going to have to incentivize transparency and competition in that marketplace to control costs. We want to maintain the high quality, we want to improve that, but we want to control costs.
Thank you. Well, let's move now to immigration and kind of put a unique business lens on this one. The U.S. immigration system hasn't been modernized in decades, while our economy and workforce needs have changed dramatically in that time. So how would you reform our immigration system to allow Colorado and the nation specifically to attract and retain the talent it needs to better compete in the global economy?
Sure. And our immigration system is a mess. It's one example of why I want to go to Washington. Nothing happens in Washington. They fight back and forth. It's all finger pointing, just like what we're seeing with the, this relief bill that we've been waiting 6 months for. We've been waiting for 6 months from Congress. Immigration, first we've got to address the humanitarian disaster at the border. This country should never have federal agents snatching children from the arms of their families and putting them in cages or cells. A number of those kids, they still haven't been able to find where they are to reunite them with their families. And now we're hearing reports of women getting hysterectomies against their wishes. These are issues that can be resolved. So let's make sure we have the resources at the border to treat treat those people seeking refugee status fairly and humanely. But we also need to have a comprehensive solution. And we got close in 2013. Michael Bennet and a group of senators created a comprehensive immigration reform package that had 68 votes in the Senate. And the House wouldn't hear it. And actually, Cory Gardner was one of those people that stepped up and said, you know, that he wouldn't support it. He didn't have a good reason. It was just the partisan Republican effort was behind that. And I think we've had enough of that. And Cory's voted to get rid of DACA. He's voted to deport Dreamers. We need to make sure Dreamers get a pathway to citizenship immediately. We need a comprehensive immigration bill that's going to include a pathway to citizenship for the 11 or 12 million people in this country who are here without documentation. This is not outside of the realm of possibility. The crucial negotiating points are pretty much settled, right? We've got to protect American workers. We've got to make sure that industries where we need more talent, and that can be anything from agricultural workers to high-tech workers. But we've got to make sure that we set up that system whereby they get work visas, and those work visas are granted in consideration of not jeopardizing the opportunities for American workers.
And I want to see if we can expand upon that a little bit, because I know a lot of companies here, whether they be ag companies, ski companies, tech companies, are in need of these work visas. How, if at all, would you change the current system of work visas?
Well, the key on this, work visas have to be the result of a careful negotiation, and I would go so far as to consider the word algorithm. But, last year out in Palisade, fruit growers were offering $18 and $20 an hour, and they still couldn't get enough workers to harvest their crop. And in those cases where we can demonstrate that there aren't sufficient American workers to do the jobs that are there, that are waiting, that are on offer, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face when we continue to retreat to these partisan, you said this, you said that, and trying to fight back and forth on that. I don't think it's that hard a thing. I've spent a lot of time out on the Eastern Plains in the last 8 or 9 years and seen how important immigrant workers are in so many of those operations. And in many ways, they become valued members of their community. To think that anyone's going to go and start rounding up undocumented workers and deporting them, there would be a revolution in rural America. I really believe that. So I am hopeful that this will be the time when we can find the alignment of self-interest in both Republicans and Democrats. This shouldn't be partisan, but both Republicans and Democrats will line up and say, all right, here are the real needs of the American economy. Here are American workers who might be at risk if we let in too many workers in one industry or another. So we're going to make sure that there's not that unfair competition for the American worker, but we're going to allow our economy to continue to grow. I mean, the appropriate workforce is a crucial part of the fuel that allows an economy to grow. When I was governor for those 8 years, one of the things that helped drive our economy was we were able to attract young, talented people, workers of all ages, really, but a lot of that energy came from young workers, and that is as powerful as the investment of capital in terms of driving an economy.
All right. Well, there are a lot of ways to drive an economy, and as long as we're talking about driving, I want to move on to the topic of transportation here, which I know is a subject a lot of people would like to hear more about. Transportation investment in Colorado is important, both in terms of moving goods and people, but also in terms of retaining our workforce who appreciate the proximity to the mountains. So if you are elected, would you push for an infrastructure stimulus package, which seemed to have come up in conversation and seems to have disappeared in many ways? How would you direct the stimulus funds to Colorado, and what would the key components of any package you would support be?
Sure, and I am unabashed in my support of infrastructure, and especially with COVID-19, this is a great way to help prime the pump, to get people back to work. We are so far behind in our infrastructure investments. And it's not just transportation. Colorado is going to be the first state if at the end of this year or early into the next year, we'll be the first state to have some level of broadband in every city and town in the state. Now, I'm not saying it's enough. We need more up speed, more down speed. We need to get further out into the countryside. But that's a first step in an infrastructure investment that is also critically important. In terms of transportation, President Trump came in, and that was what he talked about for the first 6 months. Was we were going to be the infrastructure. He was going to be the infrastructure president, the person who really drove this. And then, again, these are consequences. The 2017 tax cut, suddenly they did not have the resources where they could make those kinds of promises and investments. And investments in infrastructure are what allow long-term businesses to plan and invest to grow, to hire more employees, to create an expanding economy. So in Colorado, as part of the negotiations around the hospital provider fee, and I think a lot of people in the Chamber of Commerce got involved in this, and we're very appreciative of their support, because we were able to negotiate $1.7 billion towards the transportation in Colorado. Not enough. I mean, clearly we are behind in our infrastructure efforts, but the federal government's got to be part of that. And I think there's no question that the investment has to be a partnership. And it's going to be the federal government, it's going to be states, and in some cases, municipalities or regions. And then the other part of it is going to be public-private partnerships. And some of the sovereign wealth funds are willing to give incredibly low-interest loans to allow large-scale transit investments. I like to go back to, people say, well, you're not going to get everyone to agree to that. And when I first got elected mayor in 2003, and nobody had a chance, thought I had a chance. I was running on the basis I was going to make Denver's suburbs the greatest suburbs in America. Denver was going to do everything we could to help our suburbs. And people thought it was a joke. I got 65% of the vote in that runoff. And we went around to all the suburban mayors. And at that time, the suburbs hated Denver. Denver hated the suburbs. A lot of the suburbs hated each other. They were poaching businesses from each other. In the end, 2.5 years later, we got 34 mayors, and 2/3 of them were conservative independents or Republicans. We got all 34 mayors to support Fast Tracks. At 120 miles, the largest transit initiative in modern American history. And we also created, for the first time, to my knowledge, anywhere in the country, we agreed that no municipality would poach a business, try to take jobs from one municipality into their community. And that agreement is still in place today. Fast Tracks brought the region together in such a powerful way and really was a model for the whole state as we continued to try to, when I was a governor, to grow the entire economy. And that's what the federal government has to do. We have to take the time and the effort to go around. And when I was mayor, I spent 6 years as the chair of the Transportation and Communications Committee for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. At one point, one of our staff members called up, I think it was the 25 or 24 largest, the chambers of commerce of the 24 largest metropolitan areas. And I think it was all but 2 or all but 3. I'm sure it was 19 at least. That's the number that's in my head. But they said they would support, the chambers said they would support some sort of tax proposal and that they would support in their own community to be a partner if the federal government would step up and provide a meaningful partnership in dealing with their congestion, their traffic. And I think that's the kind of opportunity that the country needs. We've got to start finding ways to bring people together, and transportation infrastructure is a big way. And I would look at, again, the Federal Department of Transportation has metrics on this, but there are ways you can measure where you put those dollars. And we worked very hard to create the foundation. If you remember the twin tunnels, as you drive from Denver up to the mountains on I-70, we expanded those, and we did so with federal partnerships, but we had to really rethink how we use those federal allocations of dollars to make sure they conform to all the all the regulations involved. I think we can do the same thing on I-70 even today. Again, it will be hard, but I think it's doable.
Real quick follow-up, what is the role of transit versus highways in this?
So transit versus highways, and we'll see as autonomous vehicles become closer to reality. And it's still unclear how fast that transformation is going to happen, but that's going to change the algorithm a little bit. Transit has the opportunity where you have a lot of density and frequent commutes. Transit becomes a more attractive solution. It allows more people to get out of their cars and into, whether it's buses or light rail vehicles, whatever it is. It allows those who are still driving to work to get there a lot faster. And that was one of the real historic benefits from the investment in Fast Tracks, was basically people who got out of their cars and into a transit vehicle were speeding up and reducing the commute time, all those commuters who were still driving to work in their cars. In situations up to, like going up to the mountains, I think transit is more difficult because you don't have as many rush hours, right? In a normal work week, in Colorado Springs or metropolitan Denver or Larimer County, in a normal work week, you end up with 5 morning rush hours and 5 afternoon rush hours. Going up to the mountains, it's pretty much pretty heavy traffic all the time, but the real rush hours are Friday afternoon, Saturday morning going up, and then Sunday afternoon and Monday morning coming home, especially Sunday afternoon. So when we expanded the Twin Tunnels, we set the stage to begin looking at hardening what used to be the breakdown lanes and being able to use those for those specific rush hours, and so that there wouldn't be breakdown lanes. We'd still have places where people could pull off. Generally, it would be onto gravel or grass, and it allowed us to expand capacity, which again, not a long-term solution until we get to that larger expansion of capacity, though I think it does serve well.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on to education. I want to talk about it specifically from this angle. Students of color have historically been the least well-served by our educational system, and COVID is only exacerbating those achievement gaps. So what is the role of the federal government in closing these gaps and improving educational outcomes for all of our students? And as you define that role, what specific measures does the Senate need to take toward that goal?
Well, that is one of the real places where the inequity that was demonstrated over the summer, which has been there for a long time, education is a huge part of that inequity. As I said before, our workforce is a crucial part of the fuel that drives our economic expansion or creates better jobs. And that workforce has to have the skills and the education to be able to, move from one job to the better job to the next job, ultimately to create a career. And in the federal government, we have, Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education, who, Cory Gardner supported. She actually threatened our schools if they wouldn't open on time after COVID-19. She was going to take away some of their funding for the most at-risk students, the Latino community, the African-American community. Title I funds have always been underfunded. IDEA funds have been consistently underfunded for many years. We need to fix that. And when Joe Garcia was my lieutenant governor, he was also the head of higher education, but he saw the connection between early childhood education and the success of higher education. And Governor Polis is pursuing that same logic of making sure that we get more kids coming to kindergarten and first grade, knowing their alphabet, knowing how to hold a pencil, ready to go, so they don't fall far behind. We also, Joe Garcia helped put the early literacy program together, whereby we reduced the kids who were not reading at grade level at the end of third grade by more than a third. And that's a crucial part. We now know I'm a moderate dyslexic. I'm a slow reader, always have been. And you can deal with it, but it's hard. It really does, especially when you're in elementary, middle school, and high school. It creates hardship for the students. We now have the skills, so if we can identify kids who have different reading issues when they're 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, we can intervene and help their minds recognize the pattern of letters into words much more successfully, much more rapidly. And making sure those kids can read at the end of third grade is a big step towards giving them a real shot. Obviously, having scholarships, we're working to get the whole state, we're about on a sliding scale where any kid who is willing to work hard enough, if they get accepted to college, they won't end up with a bunch of debt. That's been a goal for, I've worked on the Denver Scholarship Foundation starting in 2005, so for 15 years. But that motivates these kids, again, to work harder in school. But the federal government can be a partner in each of these issues, making sure that the resources are there where they're most needed.
And let me ask you, you started to touch on this a little bit, but the issue of higher education affordability. Does the federal government need to step in any way to make higher education more affordable?
Well, I think that there are two things, two answers to that. One is that, yes, the federal government has to be a partner. We all have to be invested in that. When we had that surplus going into my last year, we took a big chunk of it and put it towards higher education in the state schools in Colorado. And for the first time in decades, we had no increase in tuition. And obviously, the tuition all over the country has been going up way beyond inflation for too long. Science and the skilled professions that were used in technology were getting lured away from universities, and universities felt they needed to keep up with a competitive salary, and that was a big part of what drove this runaway inflation in higher education all over the country. Well, what we did my last year, and Dan Baer was our Secretary of Education, we actually, again, froze tuition in its place. That was the agreement. If we put that much, a couple $100 million back into higher education. The other thing we've got to recognize is that 70% of our high school graduates aren't going to go to college, don't want to, in many cases don't want to go to college. And we started in Colorado an apprenticeship program called CareerWise that is going to allow those kids to have a 3-year apprenticeship program. At the end of it, they'll have been paid almost $30,000. They'll work 2 days a week the first year, 3 days a week the second year, 4 days a week the third year. Over that period, they'll, again, almost have been paid $30,000. They'll be living at home. Most of the kids who have been in these pilots, so they're saving some money. But they can go back to high school for the days when they're not working, or they can go to community colleges. And I think community colleges are another huge opportunity. That's a place where the federal government can recognize, we're going through a transition that's almost equivalent, probably is equivalent, to the Industrial Revolution. And so we're going to have to retrain and provide new skills training to thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Americans. And we have already in place community colleges all over the country. And the federal government needs to provide incentives so that it's a sliding scale. If someone doesn't have any money, they can still go to that community college and get the skills they need. And we've got to go to workers in industries and professions that are threatened just by the changing economy and go 2 or 3 or 4 years before they're likely to lose their job, and offer them here, if you just spend 2 days a week for the next 6 weeks, 2 nights a week on this community college class, you'll get some skills that even if you don't need them, you're going to be better off. You'll be more successful in your job. Again, I still remember when I got laid off in 1986 and I was out of work for 2 years. After a few months, you begin to see a different person in the mirror. And that's a big part of I think the division in this country is we've done such a poor job as people lost their jobs through automation. Some were outsourced. When they lost those jobs, we did nothing to really give them additional opportunities and the support they need to have in the transitions that they were facing. We better do a much better job as we go forward and this transformation of our economy continues.
Well, let's move on to another topic, thank you, and that is the issue of oil and gas. I know that you and Senator Gardner put forth some pretty different platforms, so I'm going to have a slightly different question for you than we had for him. Here, I think most people who are watching would acknowledge the oil and gas industry is an important economic sector to Colorado. as governor, you talked about balancing that economic opportunity with environmental regulations. Some in Congress now have proposed to ban new fracking permits or ban fracking on federal lands. If elected to the Senate and if faced with such a proposal, how would you vote?
Well, let me say first that I think climate change is real, and it's not just something we should observe, which is what kind of Cory Gardner's it's been his position. It's, you know, it's like Trump looked at COVID-19. It was if we don't talk about it, maybe it'll go away. Well, President Trump and I think Cory Gardner have the same attitude towards climate change, that they're not really taking it seriously enough and with a sense of urgency. Indeed, Cory Gardner voted to support Trump's nomination of a coal lobbyist to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, that's where our protections for air and water and our response to climate change, it's a big part where it starts, making sure that we have more fuel-efficient vehicles. We were working in that direction. Detroit was on board. And now suddenly that's all rolled back just to make sure that we sell more gasoline. That's not the right solution. I think we have to follow this transition to a clean economy, and we've got to accelerate it. The two coal-fired plants down in Pueblo County that Xcel is closing down, Comanche 1 and Comanche 2, are going to be replaced by wind, solar, and batteries. And we'll see what COVID changes the equation. But the original plan was that the monthly electric bill would go down. So this would be the first time in the country that, I got to remember which way I'm facing. This would be the first time in the country's history where wind and solar and batteries replaced coal, and the price went down. And that's compared to a coal plant that was already paid off. This is the way our country and our world are going to have to adapt. And there are going to be 4 times, probably 6 times more jobs created in this transition to a clean energy economy than we're going to lose. But we also got to make sure that as we're doing these investments, and again, the coal plants are not federal investments, they're not state investments, we're rebuilding our energy infrastructure. As we do this rebuilding of energy infrastructure, we've got to make sure that we really focus on displaced workers and make sure they get the training and the opportunities. We provide tax credits for additional job creation in those communities where they reside. We're going to end up having to, we created methane regulations. We were the first state in the country to create methane regulations. Methane is, when you vent it or when it leaks out, it is 80 times more harmful to climate change than carbon dioxide. 80 times worse, and yet, Cory Gardner and Donald Trump and everyone, they're rolling back the methane regulations that we worked so hard to create. And we worked with the oil and gas industry in partnership with the environmental community. So these were truly bipartisan regulations. And they're still in place in Colorado, but they've been rolled back for the rest of the country. They were copied and utilized to a large extent almost exactly in Canada, and there's still national policy there. We've got to take these kinds of best practices that we've created in Colorado. I want to go to Congress and really try to find a bipartisan way to take these transformational transitions and make sure that they become national policy, and then as we rebuild our international alliances, that they become global policy. Because again, look at the wildfires. Our wildfire season is 20 days earlier, lasts 20 days longer than it used to even 15 years ago. Look at the hurricanes that we're seeing along the Gulf Coast and the Carolinas. Look at the price of real estate along the northern coast of Florida, even just north of Miami Beach. And suddenly we're beginning to see prices come down in the low-lying areas because there is real concern about the rising sea level. The costs to society are going to be enormous, and yet we continue to, or at least some, Cory Gardner continues to feel that the environmental is not high a priority. Cory does talk about how he's kind of an environmental leader, or he tries to say that. I should point out that, NRDC, League of Conservation Voters, they all endorsed me. The LCV ranked Cory as one of the dirty dozen, one of the 12 worst polluters in the House and the Senate out of 535 people in Congress. He's one of the worst polluters. We've got to turn that around and begin making sure we protect our air and water and address climate change on a much more direct way. I will say I've never been someone who's been trying to make fracking illegal, but I have said that I think we have to make fracking obsolete. In other words, this transition is going to happen over the next few decades, and ultimately, we should all embrace this transition to a green energy economy. It's going to create jobs. It's going to drive an expansion of the economy. But we also have to recognize that we as a country have a responsibility to make sure that no one's left behind.
So, Governor, just yes or no to finish here, would you vote for measures that rolled back the ability to frack?
Well, rolled back the ability to frack. If you're saying banning fracking, yeah, I mean, we had two cases that went all the way to the State Supreme Court of Colorado, and the State Supreme Court, which is not the world's most conservative Supreme Court, it voted 7-0 that you can't ban fracking.
Okay, I'll take that as a no on banning fracking.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, Governor, we went a little longer in our conversation, so didn't get to the last question about are there any other topics that you want to bring up that are specific to the business community? But maybe I'll ask you, as you do your closing statement, to address that. Are there any other topics that we really need to bring up here that you really want to talk about that are coaching the business community? And please go ahead and give the people who are watching your closing
I'll put them into a kind of a slightly elongated final. So thank you. I want to thank you, Ed, and thank the Chamber for the opportunity here. It is always a pleasure. You know, there are only 5 and maybe 6 entrepreneurs, small business people in the U.S. Senate right now. And I think there's a difference. I think small business is the spirit and the energy of this country. And I was going to ask, one thing we talked about more is how do we support more small businesses, and how do we recognize the challenges that they're going through as a result of COVID-19 and make sure they've got protective face equipment, testing capacity. I mean, how can we still be, 10 months into this pandemic and we still don't have sufficient testing capacity? And we need testing capacity that comes back in 4 hours, not in 4 days, if we're going to know how to reopen businesses safely. I want to be one of the handful, 5 or 6 people that actually know what it's like to balance budgets in a business and know what it's like to make a payroll, and then take those skills, that experience, the optimism that you get from being successful, and that you have to be successful in small business, and take it back to Washington. Again, Cory Gardner's said he'd be an independent voice for Colorado, and he's really been the opposite. He supported Donald Trump 100% of the time. He claims he's got a bill that will protect pre-existing conditions, but it really doesn't. I mean, that's the worst lie of all. There are 2.4 million Coloradans that have pre-existing conditions, and if Cory Gardner is successful, they will lose that protection. I believe strongly that taking, that experience of a small business person who's been successful in local and state government, and take the understanding of how they should interrelate, and how all that the state and businesses should interrelate with the federal government. I think that's a big part of what's missing in Washington, and the ability to actually bring people together like we did with all the mayors around the metro area, or with the oil and gas industry scientists and the environmental scientists to create methane regulations. I want to be that independent voice. And if, Washington's a mess, it's broken. If we don't send new people to Washington, nothing's going to change. And that's why I want everybody on this streaming video, I want your support, and that's why I ask for your vote. Together we can change Washington.
Well, thank you, Governor Hickenlooper, for your closing remarks, for being with us today, for taking the time to provide insight into the issues and positions that we have brought up. So thank you again for being with us today.
Good to see you, Ed. Thank you.
And as Governor Hickenlooper exits, we would now like to bring back Senator Gardner to provide his closing remarks, giving us a safe transition period here so they're not running into each other during the socially distanced time. Senator, you also have 2 minutes for your closing remarks. Please, go ahead.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the leadership of the Denver Chamber for putting this event together, this opportunity to share our visions with the people of Colorado and this country. I think you've probably heard Governor Hickenlooper, in the most negative campaign that he's ever run, talk about the things that he disagrees with me on. But I hope that what we've been able to share with the people of Colorado is a vision that makes Colorado stronger when you have fewer taxes and less regulations, not more. That makes Colorado stronger when we have a government that is getting out of the way, not getting into the way. That when you empower people across all four corners of this state to succeed, that's exactly what we have, is a successful state with more opportunities, not less. I'm the only member of the Colorado congressional delegation, actually statewide elected official, the only statewide elected official in Colorado that lives more than 30 miles away from Denver or Boulder. I think Colorado is made strong by Denver and Boulder, but made stronger when all four corners of our state are brought together. A state that has some of the most majestic scenery in the west and some of the most majestic spaces in the east. The people on the I-25 corridor, the best innovators in our nation when it comes to technology and medicine, and opportunities to share that with the world continue to present themselves time and time again to this great state. I've worked hard to be the third most bipartisan member of the United States Senate. That's not just saying I want to go to Washington to try to do that, it's actually showing that I have done that. Legislation like the Great American Outdoors Act, legislation like the 988 bill, legislation to advance STEM careers and get more of our underserved and unserved communities, minorities, into education opportunities in science, mathematics, research, and development. It's why I've worked hard to pass more bills into law than the entire Colorado congressional delegation combined, a record of success that has led the Bureau of Land Management headquarters to Grand Junction, a record of success that has led the opening of U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs, the opening of the Arkansas Valley Conduit in southern Colorado, the return of energy dollars to western Colorado in Anvil Points, the completion of the VA hospital in Aurora, Colorado. All of those things happened because we worked together with people across the aisle to make it happen for this country. I'm an optimist about this country's future, and I remain optimistic to be able to earn your vote, ask for your support to make sure the next 6 years are brighter than ever for our great state. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Gardner. Thank you to each of the candidates for joining us today and for answering these critical questions from Colorado's business community. I also want to thank the audience. Thank you, everyone out there. The Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation, and all of today's partners and sponsors for making this what we hope was a great and informative event for you. Now, please join me in welcoming Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce President and CEO, Kelly Brough, to the stage.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you for what you've done today. You know, I think in my lifetime I've been told this is the most important election. I don't know if this is the most important one, but what we do know is we make a great deal of policy because we're a democracy at our ballot. And so it's so important that we all show up because that policy is impacting our economy more today than ever in our history. Just last week, we hosted a webinar at the Chamber where we really highlighted across the nation, brought together companies and organizations from across the nation who could share best practices about how you can engage in elections. It was nonpartisan, and it was really about how you can get involved. We hope you'll check that out. It's at our website on denverchamber.org/2020ballot. Again, thank you, Ed, not just for moderating today's event, but frankly for your reporting day in and day out. You keep us so well informed on these critical issues. It's a pleasure to work with you in the Denver Business Journal. And sincere thanks to both Senator Gardner and Governor Hickenlooper. Thank you for joining us today, and frankly for your commitment to our state. We're very grateful. I also have to thank the trustees of the Chamber. These are the organizations who make sure we're able to bring these programs. They support our foundation and the work of the Chamber. So sincere thanks to Betcher Foundation, First Bank, Health One, US Bank, VF Corporation, Wells Fargo, and Xcel Energy. Thank you for everything you're doing in our community and our state. When we close this event today, we'll send you a survey, all of you who joined us. Thank you. We really want your feedback. We use that information to improve these events all the time. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your feedback. Finally, as you heard in this conversation, what makes us unique in Colorado is we truly do work together. So to the partners who joined us from around the state to bring you this forum, our sincere thanks. We love our partnership and respect you deeply. That's it. What we'd say now is make sure you vote.